Great, thank you so much. So just before I get started, I want to just make it clear I'm using MBA as the term for MBA student or MBA graduate. I'm not asking if the degree itself is a person. First I'm just going to explain why I'm giving this talk. We're in a very interesting time in history where there's a lot of resentment and distrust towards MBAs, probably started by the Occupy Wall Street movement and kind of expanding now globally. And I think even on campus, there's sort of a divide between the business school and a lot of the other schools. And that's something that's constantly being discussed in the startup community is how do we bridge this gap between the engineering school and the business school. And I find this whole debate very interesting as somebody who wears a lot of different hats myself. I'm an MBA student. I also have a background in philosophy, and I'm currently running a tech startup with a lot of engineers. And so sort of this whole kind of distrust towards MBAs has made me wonder, are these people that I'm in class with actually bad people? Are they even people at all? Which is kind of where I'm going to be talking about today. Secondly, just some reasons not to believe anything I say. You're obviously all smart people. You're at Columbia. You've probably been trained to question the credibility of your speakers. And in this case, I'm admitting my obvious bias, which is that I am an MBA student. So I'm going to try as much as possible to stick to the facts and let you come to your own conclusions. And what I'll be talking about is basically giving some different definitions of personhood, what I feel is the best definition, and kind of my take on this whole debate about how do we solve the problem of bridging together the engineers and the MBAs. So there's a lot of different definitions of a person. If you ask somebody studying anatomy or a doctor, they'll say a person is somebody with human DNA and human anatomy, as opposed to chimpanzee, which is similar but not exactly the same anatomy. I was asking a law professor the other day in light of this talk. It was a corporate law professor, and I said, how do you define a person? He said, well, under the law, a corporation can be a person because they have a lot of the same rights. If you ask a racist person or a Nazi, they might say that a person is the person who fits a certain criteria or a certain race, and other humans are not people who don't fit those criteria. Under politics, and a lot of politicians might consider only voters people, and when they're counting the votes, the only people that matter are those who vote, and non-voters don't count. And if you ask a theologian, a lot of them will say a fetus counts as a person. So there's a lot of different views on what counts as a person. Today I'm going to be really focused on the definition from philosophy, and a lot of my old professors would kill me right now because I'm glossing over centuries-old debates in kind of a matter of 2 minutes, but that's the nature of a TED Talk. So I'm going to be talking about the philosophical definition, and I'm kind of choosing Aristotle as the definition that I'm going to be looking at. So Aristotle defined something by looking at what its unique function was, and out of the living things, he sort of first looked at plants, which he thought was the lowest form, which essentially just have the capacity to grow if you give them water and sunlight, and they'll die if you don't. Animals are sort of one layer above that, because in addition to that, they also have the capacity for pleasure and pain. And humans, our distinctive activity is actually our rationality, our ability to not just do whatever action increases my pleasure at this immediate moment and decreases my pain, but actually weigh different alternatives and carry out a course of action which leads to the maximum whatever you're trying to maximize, utility, happiness, money, and so on. I think the problem with Aristotle's definition is that he was talking at a time before we had the advent of computers and a lot of the technology that we have today, and actually what's fascinating to me is that computers, robots, artificial intelligence actually are able to think rationally, and often more rationally than we are, in making decisions. And so actually that distinctive characteristic or trait of humans is no longer so distinctive because computers actually have the same capacity for rational thinking. So that kind of got me thinking, okay, how are people or persons different from non-persons who may also have rational intelligence? And I encourage all of you guys to think about this in your head. What makes you different than a very smart robot or a computer? And what I kind of came up with is it's actually not our rationality, our ability just to optimize a certain equation, but actually it's our other forms of intelligence. So not just rational intelligence, but also moral intelligence, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and actually not just applying an existing methodology, but actually thinking about and questioning whether or not this methodology is the one that we even should be applying for a variety of other reasons. So I want to share a quote from Freud. This is over 100 years ago, but Freud said, "When making a decision of minor importance, I've always found it advantageous to consider all the pros and cons." In other words, to do a cost-benefit quantitative type analysis. However, in vital matters, the decision should come from the unconscious, from somewhere within ourselves. In the important decisions of our personal life, we should be governed by the deep inner needs of our nature. So I think what Freud's kind of getting at is if it's a fairly trivial decision, then go ahead, apply the cost-benefit analysis, do the quantitative model that you've come up with. But when it comes to really important things, actually, that's where you really need to use the capacity that actually makes you a person and look at your real inner needs, fantasies, desires, urges. Use your imagination to really think about whether or not this problem is one that you really should be solving in the first place. And now I just want to ask by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the works of C.P. Snow? Okay, so we have 2 or 3 people. So C.P. Snow was a fairly controversial figure. He was made slightly famous or infamous in 1959 when he gave a lecture on the 2 cultures in the scientific revolution in England. And what C.P. Snow talked about, and this actually turned into a book, was his view is that there's these 2 cultures, the scientists or the engineers and the people studying the humanities, and there's very little collaboration, communication, understanding between these 2 groups. And that was, in his view, going to be the fall of Western society. And I found this really interesting when I was rereading it because actually, in a lot of ways, the same conversation's happening today with how do we bridge the gap between the engineers and the MBAs or the non-engineers. And what I'm suggesting today is actually C.P. Snow was making, I think, the wrong distinction. And in reality, it's not a gap between scientists or engineers and humanities or business people. It's actually a gap between persons, as I've defined it today, and non-persons. So I think in reality, your discipline does not actually define whether or not you're a person. It's really whether or not you're using those other capacities that are unique to humans and people, like thinking emotionally, creatively, morally, and not just simply applying a methodology. So to conclude, whether or not, I think this question, hopefully I've shown today, is actually somewhat absurd because it's not actually your discipline that defines your personhood. It's your capacity to go beyond just rational thought and actually consider these other factors. And I just want to close by saying I think what's interesting is it's often not the people who are getting the best grades that are necessarily persons. It's often the people who are really stepping back and asking whether or not these are the right questions to be asking. And I think both in the business world, a lot of harm has been done by people who blindly follow a methodology or model to maximize the amount of money for a corporation. And likewise, historically, engineers have also, when they're not thinking about whether or not this is the right bomb to be making, but just blindly applying technology to make the most efficient bomb, there can also be huge implications there. So that's pretty much it. Thanks very much.